Good evening, everyone. My name is Connor Moran. I'm the director of the Wisconsin Book Festival. Thank you so much for being here tonight. We are absolutely delighted to be hosting Larry Tye for his book Demagogue about Senator Joseph McCarthy. And Larry will appear this evening alongside John Nichols, who many of us know from his various roles at the Capital Times as an associate editor, The Nation magazine, and The Progressive. We couldn't be more delighted to be hosting these events for you all spring and summer long here on our Crowdcast channel. And I just want to take a moment to say thank you to Madison Public Library and the Madison Public Library Foundation. Their support for online cultural events has been absolutely unwavering. They are, oh my gosh, I thought John just said, I'm so excited to see John Nichols. Their support for these events has been absolutely unwavering, and they have been so dedicated to bringing author events to all of you, whether you're watching in your home in Madison or across the country or across the globe. We have seen an incredible uptick in our audience of people from all over, and it is just absolutely wonderful to see the response. So thank you to everyone who's here tonight, everyone who's come to one, and to all the sponsors who have made sure that these events keep going. Without further ado, I'd like to bring John and Larry to the screen and step away myself. Here's Larry Tye and John Nichols.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. And Larry, thanks for coming all the way from Massachusetts to be here with us tonight.
It's great to.
Larry is on Cape Cod as we speak. And we have about 100 people, or close to 100 people with us. Some more may join us as we go along. As was explained up front, we will take questions. I'll ask Larry some questions up at the start, and then about halfway in, we'll invite some questions from you folks, and wherever you want to take it, we're very excited to go there. So let me just say a couple things up front about Larry. First and foremost, he is a journalist, and his books are journalism at its very best. And we live in a time when journalism is under attack. Not only by political figures, but also simply by the economic forces of the moment in which we live and the challenges we face. And so it is a great honor to be with another journalist and someone who really has practiced the craft in some of the most creative and exciting ways. So that's only a beginning of discussing Larry's many talents and many contributions. I'll also mention that we're talking tonight about a new book that he's put out, Demagogue, which is his book on Joe McCarthy, the former senator from Wisconsin. But I do want to emphasize that Larry has a canon of books that are worthy of your attention if you haven't read them already. His biography of Bobby Kennedy was brilliant and really took the exploration of Kennedy's story and Kennedy's journey to some new and exciting places. His biography of Satchel Paige was a vital contribution to not just sports history, but the history of really the evolution of this country in so many fundamental ways. And finally, my favorite of his books is Rising from the Rails, which is his story of the sleeping car porters. And I'm a huge fan of A. Philip Randolph, and who was the leader of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and chairman of the March on Washington in 1963. And Larry just captured that brilliantly. So it's my most highly recommended of his books. But we're here tonight to talk about a brilliant new book, Demagogue. And I wanted to start out, Larry, by asking you, I noticed that in some of your other biographies, you had the name of the person, Satchel or Bobby Kennedy. In the case of Joe McCarthy, you chose a word, demagogue. Why was that?
So before I answer that question, I want to just say that John is one of the many people that I interviewed for this book, and two things stood out about my interview with him. One is he was the youngest person that I interviewed when I was trying to get a sense of people who really knew the McCarthy era and knew Joe McCarthy. And the other was that he was among the very smartest people that I interviewed. Any of you who are Wisconsin readers know his work from the Cap Times and from The Nation and from all kinds of other places that he's published. So having somebody who was as tuned in to not just McCarthy, but McCarthy's context in Wisconsin and The Nation was extraordinary. And the reason that I picked a one-word title that was not McCarthy's name was because this is a book that is about America's love affair with bullies from our very earliest days until today. And I felt that the subtitle would capture the sense that it was that front and center in this book was low blow Joe McCarthy, but that it was also important to see him in the context. The reason we are here talking about him 70 years after his beginnings of his crusade is because he was the archetype for this bully or demagogue figure in American history. That's a long-winded explanation, and I promise to keep my other answers shorter, John.
You don't have. You can. We're actually here to hear what you have to say. So a little bit long-winded is okay. And I'm going to keep you right on the title for a second. In that title, you use the term "the long shadow," the life and long shadow of Joe McCarthy. Give us a sense of what you mean by that. That long shadow. Is it, the impact of what he did, or is it really this broader notion of the demagogue?
So he partly cast the long shadow because of the impact of what he did, and not just him as Joe McCarthy, but the orchestrator of this whole movement, McCarthyism. And it is also to say that we just can't stop with his death. We have to look at how he influenced demagogues that came after, whether they be David Duke, George Wallace, or people who are in our political context today. I want to just say one other thing. The temptation with a lot of the interviews that I've been doing on Joe McCarthy is to talk about Donald Trump. And this is really a book about Joe McCarthy. Donald Trump's name is mentioned only in the preface and in the epilogue, and yet his story and the story of other demagogues is there in a way in every page in the book.
And as long as you brought Trump up, I'm going to join you in trying to avoid a very deep discussion of him. But tell me, when you started putting this book together, it was around the start of his presidency, wasn't it?
So actually a week before the election in 2016, I had signed up to write a different book, and that was the biography of Barack Obama. And the day after the election, I realized we will not know Barack Obama's legacy until after the era of Trump is over. And it also became apparent to me the day after the election that what I thought was a story of almost ancient history in America in terms of demagoguery is the story of today, that we have not outgrown this affair, this attraction to bullies in the ways that I hope we had.
Mm-hmm. So let's get into the book a little bit. There's one interesting element of it, which is that you take a very casual approach to referring to him. I guess the way to say it is that when you read the book, which has a wonderful narrative throughout it, just a great stream going through it, it's a little bit like being, I don't know, maybe sitting out in front of somebody's house in a couple of lawn chairs or by the beach or maybe even at the end of a bar with somebody who starts to tell a very long story. And you kind of come back, and it's very human in so many ways. And I wondered if you sought to do that.
So I think if you're writing a biography of somebody, you have to humanize them and you have to make a reader feel like they are getting into the spirit of this person's life. And whether the person is somebody who you think of by the end of the book as a hero or a villain, they ought to know them. And so it was a very conscious thing. The same way Bobby Kennedy, I talked about him generally using the word Bobby, and that was a conscious decision. With this one, it is lots of Joes, and it's not just to vary it from McCarthy, but it is to try to get in and see him from the inside.
Well, what did you see when you looked inside?
I saw that on the one hand, I want to go back actually to a quote that was one of the reasons that I've had Joe McCarthy in the back of my head ever since I was doing my research on Bobby Kennedy. And it is a quote from the one person of the 450 people that I interviewed for the Bobby Kennedy book that was irreplaceable, a woman named Ethel Kennedy, Bobby's widow. And she said something about Joe McCarthy that I couldn't get out of my head. And it was that Joe McCarthy might be a monster to much of America, but to Bobby and to me, he was just plain good fun. And the idea of Joe McCarthy as good fun was counterintuitive to me. And I felt there was some side of him, the side of him that caused Wisconsin to overwhelmingly elect him in two different statewide elections, that I wanted to understand. And so I came out of this book feeling like, on the one hand, Joe McCarthy became much more of a human being as opposed to the caricature that we study in our history books than I had ever realized. He is somebody that I would love to have gone out for a beer with and sat down and really understood all of his charms and all of his ability to convince Ethel and Bobby Kennedy that he was a great guy to spend time with. On the other hand, the documents that I looked at made him seem even more sinister than the history books did. So the upside was that he became more of a human being. The downside was that a lot of the political things that he did and his motivation in doing them, the more we could see some of the papers that gave a more candid sense of that, made him somebody that if you went out for a beer with him at night, that would be fine, but you sure as heck wouldn't want to be in the witness stand when he was grilling you during the day.
Mm-hmm. One of the most interesting things about McCarthy was his ability to joke with the people he was about to attack, or to actually jokingly attack them. And at the Cap Times, we remember the stories of John Patrick Hunter, our longtime political reporter, who battled with McCarthy, throughout the 40s and throughout the 50s for sure. And when Hunter would go to events, he said he actually started to hide behind poles at the events because he knew that if McCarthy saw him in the crowd, McCarthy would launch into a rather jovial attack on the Cap Times as the Pravda of the Prairie, and an attack on Hunter. But it wouldn't be so mean-spirited. It would almost be for the fun and the joking in the crowd. And I think that was very common with him.
So I think that suggests two things about McCarthy. One is that he didn't quite understand how brutal he was being. And being there with an angry crowd as a journalist being called out by McCarthy was putting Hunter at a risk. And I think that McCarthy didn't quite get that aspect of it, but it also was that Joe McCarthy really did see this as a bit of a game.
Yeah.
And he assumed that everybody who was there, journalists or politicians that he was going after, would understand that it was a game, they would understand the rules, and they would be able to go out after with him and put it all behind them, because after all, it was a game.
I think you're right about that. And I think that comes out in your book in quite a few ways, because you do talk about these human relationships that he had along the way. I don't want to take us through, the whole narrative of McCarthy's story, because I do think people should read the book. But I am interested in your thoughts about, at the start of his career, he was a New Deal Democrat at one point, or at least a relatively liberal character. Was that merely opportunistic, or do you think that's where he actually started and then evolved into something else?
So you can't talk about much of anything with Joe McCarthy and leave out the opportunistic element. Was he really the liberal that he started as, or the ultra-conservative that he ended up as? And I think that where he started out is where he had the most choice. He wasn't sure what could get him elected. When he ran for district attorney, he ran not just as a New Deal, FDR-loving Democrat, but I think as somebody who was fired up enough about that he really believed that was what was best for the country. That was also his Irish roots suggested that the party of FDR was where he belonged. And I think that the only time he questioned his being a Democrat and his being a liberal was when he realized that he couldn't be elected from the area around Appleton that he grew up. And he was game to do whatever it took to be elected. And so some night, probably in the middle of the night when nobody was looking, he went and changed his party registration to Republican. And as you know the story, it wasn't just that he became a Republican. The opening in the Republican Party, the progressive wing of the Republican Party, was taken up by Robert La Follette Jr. And And the opening was the stalwart Republicans, the most conservative element of the Republican Party. And if that was the opening, Joe McCarthy was going to take it. If it meant changing his ideology, he was going to do that. He was going to do, and he did whatever it took. And I think that that was, if there was any theme that ran throughout his life, it was the theme of whatever it took.
Mm-hmm. And were there people along the way who helped him to make that change? I'm thinking of some of the folks up in Appleton, particularly Van Susteren and others.
So there were a lot of people who helped him. Urban Van Susteren was his best friend and his probably sagest advisor, and he helped steer him. The people at the newspaper in Appleton, at the Post-Crescent, helped steer him. He had lots of people who ended up being his enablers, being his benefactors, and being his guides, and he was willing to take advice from anybody who was willing to serve the ends of Joe McCarthy.
And they liked that, right? I mean, that made him appealing.
They loved that. I think Van Susteren was an extraordinary character, and I think Van Susteren, from comments that he made over the years to everybody from journalists to authors to his children, they suggest that Van Susteren truly adored Joe McCarthy, that Van Susteren understood McCarthy's flaws and shortcomings as well as anybody did, but that he was a loyal friend and he stuck with him. And he never publicly repudiated McCarthy, even when his temptation was to do that, and even when he was telling his kids that McCarthy had gone off the rails again. And I think that that was, a lot of people had a lot of loyalty to Joe McCarthy, including somebody whose entire family was representing the iconic liberal first family of America, the Kennedys. And Bobby Kennedy remained loyal enough to Joe McCarthy that he not only never publicly questioned him, but when his brother Jack said, "Stay away from McCarthy's funeral" in Appleton in 1957, Bobby said, "Thank you, Jack, that's interesting advice." He flew into Appleton with all these Republican congressional people, and on the one hand, he went up in the choir loft so nobody could see him at the funeral. At the graveside service, he stood off to the side where nobody could see him. After the funeral, he begged the journalists who were there not to put his name in those stories and not get him in trouble with his big brother Jack. But until the very end, and until today, for Ethel, the Kennedys generally, and Bobby specifically, stayed very loyal to him, because McCarthy, for all of his flaws, was a guy who inspired on a personal level that kind of enormous loyalty.
And it's also notable that John Kennedy really danced around McCarthy rather than standing up to him.
So John Kennedy had a different relationship. Bobby was a more straightforward, less plotting guy than John Kennedy. John Kennedy was always thinking of his next step. I'm convinced that the day that John Kennedy was born, he started plotting his presidential campaign. And
I think his father was doing that.
His father did that, absolutely. But Jack picked up the cudgel quickly. And in 1952, when John Kennedy was a relatively unknown and unaccomplished congressman from Massachusetts, running against the very powerful Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, to try to take that seat away from the Republicans in Lodge, the Papa Joe Kennedy had one big request for Joe McCarthy, which was stay the heck out of Massachusetts. Joe Kennedy had given enough money to Joe McCarthy that whatever he asked, McCarthy was likely to say yes. Joe Kennedy was smart enough to know that if Joe McCarthy came to Massachusetts and campaigned for the Republican Lodge, lots of Irish Catholic voters who loved Joe McCarthy, whether they were Republicans or more likely they were Democrats, would do what he said to do. And Jack Kennedy ended up winning that Senate seat by just 3 percentage points in a year of an Eisenhower landslide where Eisenhower won by 9 points. I think Joe Kennedy and Jack Kennedy were right. McCarthy staying out of Massachusetts ensured that Jack Kennedy won that seat. And Jack Kennedy, for the rest of his life, had a certain kind of loyalty for McCarthy. When McCarthy was censured, the only senator in the Senate at that time who not only didn't show up and vote, but who we don't know how they would have voted, was Jack Kennedy. Not exactly the kind of profile and courage that Jack Kennedy was famous for talking about.
I thought you were going to take us to that term right there.
Okay.
So you're from Massachusetts, and we've already spoken far too much about Massachusetts here. So let's talk about Wisconsin. In that 1946 campaign that brought McCarthy to the U.S. Senate, he took on Senator Robert M. La Follette Jr., who had come back into the Republican Party after having been out of it for a dozen years as a leading figure with his brother in the Progressive Party. McCarthy obviously was making an opportunistic run. He had the backing of the party establishment, but La Follette was an epic figure in the state. And it appears that, at least early on, La Follette did not take McCarthy seriously, or did not take him seriously enough.
So you've just captured what is the through line for all of McCarthy's campaigns. His opponents seldom took him seriously. Tom Coleman, who was the dean of the stalwart Republicans in the state, never took him seriously as the guy to carry their cudgel against La Follette. Tom Coleman's dream, and I'm convinced this kept him up nights, was somehow beating La Follette. And the idea that Joe McCarthy would be his vehicle for doing it is something that he didn't accept until he watched McCarthy. And he watched McCarthy go out and hustle all of the Republican activists, and especially young Republicans, in a way that finally Coleman became convinced that this was the guy who was so determined to win that he was the guy he ought to get behind. The way I think that Joe McCarthy beat La Follette was partly what you were suggesting, that La Follette beat himself. It was almost like he was surrendering. I think he was getting older. He had been in office long enough. His health wasn't great, and I'm not convinced that he was sure that he really wanted another term, or at least not wanted it enough to fight hard and to fight dirty like he was going to have to do to beat a guy like Joe McCarthy. So McCarthy raised legitimate issues in the campaign, like whether La Follette had been captured by the Republican establishment, whether he still had the kind of rootedness in Wisconsin that voters in any state want to see when they're electing somebody. But he also fought dirty, and he raised issues like the fact that La Follette owned a home in Virginia, and McCarthy was suggesting that that was a mansion, and it was a place that La Follette really considered home, and not Wisconsin. And if anybody shouldn't have had to show that they had deep roots in the state of Wisconsin, it was somebody whose family had given up as much as the La Follettes had and served the state, not just for a long time, but really well. But by the time La Follette finally came back and started campaigning hard, the campaign was essentially over. And McCarthy won by out-hustling his opponent in a way that La Follette realized at the end.
And it was very close. It was actually about 3,000 votes, right?
So it was a very close election. 5,000. It was an unlikely election for McCarthy to be able to depose La Follette, and it was the toughest election that he would ever face. The easy thing was beating the Democrat after you beat La Follette for the Republican nomination. And that was, so when McCarthy shows up in Washington in early 1947, he shows up there arguably as one of the biggest surprises in that new class of senators, arguably the least qualified new senator to be taking a seat like that. But he also, from his earliest days, gave an indication that if anybody had been paying attention then, that he was somebody to be reckoned with. He was throwing bombs before he even was seated in the Senate, essentially saying that striking minors, that we ought to think about using a death penalty against striking minors. Now, whether he really thought that, nobody will ever know, but I don't think he did. He just knew instinctively how to get journalists like you and me to pay attention to him. And that was partly by being outrageous. It was partly by offering them, without having to say it, that he would put them on page one. And it was partly by charming them. He was charming.
He was. And before we get into that, because I think that's really vital, I want to do one more thing on that 46 election just to close the circle. I think that one of the interesting things was that McCarthy may well have won that 46 primary because of the rise of the modern Democratic Party. Because the Democratic Party actually, in 46, after having been on the sidelines through most of the 30s and the 40s in Wisconsin, had genuine candidates and genuine competition. Dan Hoan, the former mayor of Milwaukee, had come over to run for governor. McMurray was a good candidate for the U.S. Senate. You had primaries for congressional seats, and suddenly some of that energy had gone over to this other place.
So I think you're exactly right. And the cliched story that's told about that election is that McCarthy was elected with the support of communists. And wasn't this an irony? Well, in fact, much more important was the fact that there really was a Democratic alternative, that a lot of progressives who would have been tempted to go with La Follette into the Republican Party and stick with him there ended up instead voting in a Democratic primary, and that La Follette hadn't counted on the Democrats offering a real alternative for the first time in an election like that in Wisconsin. And that was just one more miscalculation on his part that made McCarthy's role as a kingmaker easier than it might have been otherwise.
Absolutely. And so I think McCarthy himself, perhaps a little surprised to get to Washington, arrives out there, and as you say, a bomb thrower from the start, but very unfocused. He didn't find his mark right away.
So he didn't find his mark. You're being kind to him. He gets there at the start of 1947, and I don't think he really found his mark until early 1950. He tried lots of issues. Some issues that were legitimate issues like housing for returning servicemen, his fellow soldiers from World War II. Some issues that I think were outrageous and may have suggested an element of anti-Semitism by McCarthy, like defending the perpetrators of one of the deadliest massacre of U.S. troops during World War II, the famous Malmedy massacre, defending the Nazi perpetrators and suggesting that the Jewish prosecutors couldn't be objective about it because they were Jews. And after all, this was a victor's justice. And he tried just about everything in terms of an issue to grab onto. And it wasn't until February of 1950 that he found one that turned out to be magical for him.
And let's talk about that. But let's also understand that because he was outrageous and a bit bumbling, and because the Democratic Party was sort of starting to get its act together, winning the Attorney General's job in Wisconsin in 1948 with Tom Fairchild, Truman winning the state in 48, McCarthy was starting to get a little scared that he might be vulnerable. He wanted to make a name. Right, he was looking for something to. I'll go so far as to say, my sense is he was getting a little desperate to have some focus for his Senate career because he was coming up for re-election.
Yes, so if you've made it through 3 years and you're still looking like a backbencher and like a patsy to take on by any ambitious Democrat because you look so weak and ill-defined, he was desperate. He was desperate because it would have been an embarrassment to lose his battle for re-election, and he was desperate because holding on to power, whether or not he knew what he was going to do with that power, was one of the things that was most vital to Joe McCarthy. He had made it at a very young age to a point that I think only in his wildest dreams had he ever conceived he would make it to, and the idea of having all that taken away from him made him desperate, which is why he was willing to do anything to find the issue to latch onto at that point.
So one of the great things in your book is, or one of the great things that you discovered in your research, was that he went to Wheeling, West Virginia, with 2 speeches. Am I right?
So you're exactly right. So Wheeling, West Virginia, or as his staffers called it, Wheeling, West by God, Virginia, we're talking about February 1950, on the one day of the year when Republicans all across the country do the same thing, which is on Abraham Lincoln's birthday, they celebrate, and they use that as a way to rally their party and raise money. And if you're a prominent U.S. senator, you get invited to places like Milwaukee or Boston, like Washington or New York. When you're a backbencher like Joe McCarthy, you get invited to Wheeling, West Virginia. He shows up there that night, as you suggest, with 2 speeches in his briefcase. One is a snoozer on national housing policy, which is something he actually knew a bit about.
And kind of cared about.
And cared about. And had he picked that speech to give that night, 70 years later, you and I wouldn't be talking about him because he would have probably been that one-term senator we were talking about. Instead, he pulls out of his briefcase a speech that I am convinced he read for the first time when he was delivering it that night. It was written by a journalist and by various staffers who did the editing on it. And he holds up in his hand a sheaf of papers. And as part of his speech, he says, I have in my hand a list of 205 spies at the U.S. State Department. They're people that Truman should have known about, the president he should have gotten rid of, and this is a scary thing. And he was doing this at a moment in American history when we were scared to death about the Soviet threat. And it wasn't just the Soviets. We had watched very recently the nationalist China turn into Red China. We had watched the atomic spies Ethel and Julius Rosenberg be arrested, tried, and convicted. We were about to teach our children that something that younger listeners tonight won't believe, but it was the so-called duck and cover strategy, which is when the atomic bomb comes, you put your hands over your head and you duck under your desk and you'll be okay. And that is how petrified we were. Joe McCarthy understood those fears better than just about anybody. He understood that rather than just saying there were traitors in our government, if you named and counted the traitors, that was the cowboy way to capture America's imagination. He also understood something that I think was the ultimate in cynicism, which is if he delivered a bombshell of a speech like that in Washington, the journalists who were listening would have known who to call instantaneously at the State Department for comment. Had he delivered a speech like that in the afternoon as a lunch speech, the journalists on a deadline would have had plenty of time to call their Washington colleagues and find who to call for comment. He delivered the speech at night. He delivered it with only two reporters who really mattered in the audience, one from the local Wheeling newspaper and one the local AP reporter. And what happened afterwards was just what McCarthy dreamed of. Within 2 days, he was on page one of every newspaper in America, and he never turned back. And this was the birth of Joe McCarthy in terms of being associated with the anti-communist issue, and this was the birth, I think, that night of McCarthyism.
And I would agree with you. And then also the other interesting part about it was that it really was seat of the pants. The number changed all the time.
So not only did the number change, it changed and it went back and forth a bunch of numbers, but the two he came back to most were the 205 that we think is what he said in Wheeling, and in his personal and professional papers, this wonderful stash of material at Marquette University, there were a bunch of different numbers in the various versions of the speech. There was 205, and that was crossed out, but the other number he kept coming back to was 57. And without making too light of it, one of the places that a pal of his suggested that he got the number 57 was he loved hamburgers and steaks. And it was suggested that maybe on the way to his dinner, he stopped at a restaurant, poured Heinz 57 sauce on, and that number captured his imagination. Now, I don't believe it. On the other hand, I think that given how fatuous the number 205 was, it could have come from anywhere, because there were not 205 names in his sheaf of papers, and there were not 205 spies that we know of to this day at the State Department.
And this is where it gets interesting because, as you say, it's something that could have been easily checked out, easily challenged. The numbers were not steady. The reality didn't line up with what he was saying. And yet, in relatively short order, he was chairing national hearings and speaking to the whole country, being paid an immense amount of attention. And at least for a period there, a lot of people who should have gotten in his way or should have, slowed him down, didn't. The media as well as the political class gave him a lot of space in which to operate.
So On the one hand, I want to agree with you, and I want to say, not just because you're here, John, but one of the only newspapers that was right on Joe McCarthy from almost the very beginning was your Capital Times. And a lot of people took it on the chin by being right in the way that he attacked them. But the truth is that even when people called him out at the beginning, it looks like he had a free ride. But he was called out very early on by a senator named Millard Tydings from Maryland.
Yes.
Tydings headed up a special committee to investigate McCarthy. Tydings didn't mince a word when he called McCarthy a fraud and a hoax. And what happened to Millard Tydings sent a lesson to anybody who would be tempted to likewise call him out. That November, so he delivers a speech, McCarthy delivers his famous speech in February of 1950. That spring, Tydings and his committee come out with the report calling him the hoax. And that November, McCarthy is in Maryland, having recruited a Republican to run against him, having gotten his wealthy Texas benefactors to back this Republican, having lent the Republican, a guy named Butler, McCarthy's bag of dirty tricks, and having beaten a incredible titan of Maryland politics, Millard Tydings, the same way he took down Bob La Follette Jr. in Wisconsin, and that sent a shockwave through the Senate. The message was very simple: take on Joe McCarthy and beware the bulldozer.
And yet, Margaret Chase Smith did take him on.
She did.
And a few others.
So I just have to say a word about Margaret Chase Smith because she's a favorite of mine. Margaret Chase Smith was the only woman in the Senate. She was a senator from Maine. And Margaret Chase Smith took on Joe McCarthy early on, even though McCarthy, in his classic charming side, had promised Margaret Chase Smith that he would put her name up for vice president for whoever got the nomination in 1952. And Margaret Chase Smith had enough conviction that she authored what was called a Declaration of Conscience, condemning McCarthy for his un-American activities in the way he grilled witnesses and ignored their rights, the way everything about his campaign was offensive to her. She takes to the Senate floor, she finds 6 moderate Republicans to sign on to her, and McCarthy tried to do to her what he did to Millard Tydings. First, he was the master of the name calling, and he dubbed her Snow White and her 7 dwarfs, her fellow senators. Then he took to Maine and tried to beat her. And Smith was strong enough as a candidate that he couldn't beat her, but she lost. She ran in a much closer election than she had the time before. And lastly, what I want to say about Margaret Chase Smith is she was a relatively unexceptional senator. And the one thing that we remember about her today, and this sort of is suggesting something to enablers of other demagogues, the one thing we remember about her is that she had the courage to stand up to Joe McCarthy at a time when almost nobody was. And that should be encouraging to people who find that courage, but over the years, there generally aren't many of them.
And as we speak of the long shadow, before we go into some questions from folks, I did want to note that Margaret Chase Smith's speech calling McCarthy out for what was then an incredibly destructive approach and use of his platform came full circle during the Brett Kavanaugh hearings, because when Susan Collins voted to confirm Brett Kavanaugh, you had Mitch McConnell on the floor of the Senate comparing Susan Collins supporting Donald Trump's nominee for the Supreme Court to Margaret Chase Smith.
So Susan Collins was somebody who was incredibly helpful to me for the book and somebody who I interviewed. And she was helpful by, long before I was writing my book, agreeing. She held the same gavel that Joe McCarthy had as chair of the permanent subcommittee on investigations. And she decided, after 50 plus years of all of his closed door hearings being under lock and key, she decided to make those transcripts public. And those gave us a sense of Joe McCarthy unhinged. And so when I interviewed her, I knew that her role model as a senator was Margaret Chase Smith. And I said, are you intending to take this to heart in terms of what you do as a senator? And it is very clear that she adores Margaret Chase Smith and that she sees herself as a model of following in Margaret Chase Smith's footsteps. Her opponent in the current Senate race, the very heated Senate race in Maine, doesn't do that. And everybody is using this Margaret Chase Smith model as saying, rather than looking at her as Susan Collins' role model, as saying, you've let down Margaret Chase Smith. And whether she has or not, the voters in Maine will decide in this election. But
that was a very political answer, my friend. But I honor your reference there, because I think the documents that you got from those hearings, the materials that you got access to, was incredible. You brought out a lot of new material as regards Joe McCarthy.
Yeah, so I was really lucky to have that material. And John, you know from knowing me a bit that it wasn't because I was charming that I got that material. I think that in terms of the wonderful Marquette files, the reason they opened them up were two reasons. One is I was enough of a pest that the only way to get rid of me may have been to open it. And the other is I had an incredibly important ally who was Greta Van Susteren,
Yes.
Urban Van Susteren's daughter, and the wonderful TV personality. And the Marquette people were extraordinary in helping me make sense of those documents. And I think they were as surprised as I was that I got the access. And sadly, rather than them being open generally, they were open for the time that I was looking at them, and they are now back under, at least temporarily, under lock and key again.
But you wrote the hell out of them. So you got a lot out of it.
I'm not going to comment on that, and I appreciate you saying that. Thank you.
Right. Tell me, before we go to questions, what was, in looking at the hearings, I know we could go through and go, chapter and verse through all of them. What was the most striking thing that you learned from looking at those documents?
So the shocking thing to me was, normally we expect a politician to be more outrageous when the cameras are there watching what they're doing, and that when they go in closed session, nobody's watching, so you can be reasonable. Joe McCarthy flipped that script. He was more reasonable in his public hearings, in the Army McCarthy and other hearings, which is a sign, since he wasn't especially reasonable there, of how unhinged he became in the private hearings. And I think he did a couple things. One was any notion of witnesses having any real rights went out the window, and they were presumed guilty from the start. A second was he held, in violation of Senate tradition, one-man hearings. And when the one man, Joe McCarthy, was gone, he turned the hearings over to sophomoric staffers like Roy Cohn to do the grilling and the violation of people's rights on his behalf. And the other thing was that I think he used those hearings as a test run for witnesses who would stand up to him and who were eloquent. They didn't show up in public hearings. For ones who were more easily pressed and who would more easily cave into him, they were the perfect patsies that he wanted in the public. So he got to run these wonderful test runs, and any sense of any rules and propriety went out the window because nobody was there to keep him in check.
And it was an incredibly jarring and incredibly disturbing moment in American history, because not only when he did those public hearings was he doing Senate hearings, he ended up on television. And I think that's one last thing I want to bring out as regards your book, that you do a very good job of talking about or helping us to understand this intersection of modern media and the demagogue.
So again, the history book version of what happened to Joe McCarthy is that it was a leprechaun-like lawyer from Boston named Joe Welch, who in the middle of the hearings when McCarthy attacked Welch's young associate, Welch defended him by saying, "Senator, have you no sense of decency?" And that was the moment that turned everything around. I would say two quick things about that. One is that Welch was as good an actor as he was a lawyer, and he had that line ready to go, knowing that McCarthy would step over any sense of propriety, whether it was attacking his young associate or doing something. So he was ready to go with that line. And the other is, what brought McCarthy down in my mind is the public seeing, with day after day of televised testimony, that Joe McCarthy was not this heroic champion that they started out believing, that he was more like the town bully. And in the course of those hearings, he went from the Gallup polls telling us he was starting out with a 50% favorability, which meant as a popular public figure in America, the only one he trailed was Dwight Eisenhower. By August, in the end of the hearings, he was down to 34%. And that is when his fellow senators developed the backbone and were willing to take him on. A demagogue looks great when they're up at 50%. They start looking vulnerable when their numbers fade and enablers stop enabling.
Well, let's talk about enablers, and let's go to the questions from some of our great audience here. And the question that they most want me to ask you is about Roy Cohn. And particularly, what does McCarthy's relationship with Roy Cohn tell us about our current president? Because, of course, this is the intersection between the two.
So for anybody who doesn't know, if there's anybody in the world who doesn't know who Roy Cohn is, Roy Cohn was a brilliant and arrogant young lawyer with a record of successfully prosecuting communists that Joe McCarthy brought in 1953 when he took over the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. And Roy Cohn was his alter ego. Roy Cohn, I think, reinforced every bad instinct in Joe McCarthy's bones. And Roy Cohn was the first choice for that job. But if we were doing a what if, we would say, what if he had hired the second choice? Because the second choice for that job was Bobby Kennedy. And would Joe McCarthy have been a different Joe McCarthy if rather than Roy Cohn whispering in his ear, it was the one-day liberal icon Bobby Kennedy? But Roy Cohn, we flash forward from Roy Cohn being McCarthy's enabler, Roy Cohn helping bring down McCarthy by having kicked off a lot of the controversy that gave us the Army McCarthy hearings. We flash forward 50 years. Roy Cohn is now not so young. He is still brilliant and arrogant. And a guy named Fred Trump and a guy named Donald Trump, when Donald Trump was entering the cutthroat world of New York real estate, his dad and he recognized that he needed somebody to advise him, to instruct him how to get involved with that world. And who better than the guy who had learned at the knee of Joe McCarthy to come in and instruct somebody how to deal with a cutthroat environment. Roy Cohn passed on McCarthy's lessons to Trump, and Trump has said repeatedly during his presidency, when he gets into trouble, I sure wish I had a Roy Cohn by my side to help me out with this. And what I think he's really saying, only it would be un-PC to say this, is I wish I had a Joe McCarthy at my side to tell me how to deal with this.
That takes us to a second question, and you referenced it in your first, and that's about the relationship between Joe McCarthy and Bobby Kennedy. You are in the rare circumstance here of having done biographies of both men. Let's get in Bobby Kennedy's head for a moment here and figure out how much did Bobby Kennedy agree with Joe McCarthy? How much did he just find him a charming man?
So I want to just back off for 1 second and say one thing. If there's anybody young in our viewing audience tonight, watch John for the embodiment of how a good journalist asks really smart questions. And you don't often see it because all you see is their story in the newspaper afterwards. But these are really, I've done a lot of these things, and these are really terrific questions. And so to go to Bobby Kennedy and Joe McCarthy, they were on exactly the opposite trajectories in terms of their career. Bobby Kennedy starts out as not just a Joe McCarthy staffer, but a Joe McCarthy true believer. He believes that Joe McCarthy and his cause of anti-communism in that Cold War era were righteous. He started out his life as a Cold War, he was a Democrat, but he was a Cold War and a relatively conservative guy. And he's on his way to becoming the iconic liberal figure in modern day American history. Joe McCarthy starts out his life as this liberal that Bobby Kennedy becomes one day, and he's on his way to becoming the iconic Cold War conservative that even 70 years later, he remains an icon to much of the conservative movement in America. And the idea that they intersected was for a single reason that we talked about early on. It was because Papa Joe Kennedy said that they ought to come together. And whatever Joe Kennedy did, whatever Joe Kennedy asked for, Bobby did. And whatever Joe Kennedy asked Joe McCarthy for, Joe McCarthy did. And he saw a union. I think that Joe Kennedy, who was a classic realpolitik, a classic Machiavellian kind of political figure, understood that Bobby would get tutored by the master. And it's ironically the same feeling that I think had Fred Trump bring in Roy Cohn years later, they both felt that their sons ought to know how to fight in dirty politics, tough politics, whatever you want to call it, and they had master tutors in teaching them that. And I think a lot of the lessons that Joe McCarthy taught Bobby Kennedy, Bobby ended up using later on behalf of liberal causes.
Mm-hmm. And we have from our questions from the crowd here tonight, you will understand that you are in Madison, Wisconsin, a town filled with researchers. So there are actually several questions about how you did the research on the book that are very interesting. And one of them is at the Historical Society here in Wisconsin. Did you find materials there that were of interest to you as regards all this? And were there any materials that particularly stood out?
So there were wonderful materials at the Historical Society, and I don't want to say too much about that because there is a piece due out soon that I just did the last edits on last night. I can't remember, I'm terrible on names, but the name of the Wisconsin Historical Society magazine, what is it called? Wisconsin History, maybe?
Yeah, I think you're pretty much there.
So, whatever it is, some of that material will be in there, but let me just say, to understand the context of Wisconsin politics, the staff at the Historical Society and the documents were almost as good as sitting down with John and Dave. How do I say Dave's last name?
Zweifel.
Zweifel. Yes, yeah. Zweifel. So I'm an idiot from Massachusetts who comes in knowing something about the Kennedys, but nothing about Wisconsin politics. And anything I got right, I would attribute to people like John, and anything I got wrong about Wisconsin politics is on me. But the Historical Society was really wonderful to me. The idea of having two sets of archives, like the Marquette and like WHS, is an author and a historian's dream.
And they actually, I know the McCarthy materials at the Historical Society are particularly well done, because I just did an article for the magazine that you're writing for on Dan Hone and the rise of the modern Democratic Party, which intersected with a lot of this, and it's an incredibly valuable resource. So let me ask you.
I want to just say, can I say one more quick thing in terms of the understanding the history of McCarthy in Wisconsin? One thing that authors depend on is that they can learn from all the biographers who have come before them. And there are lots of great biographers of McCarthy. And the idea that people like Thomas Reeves left his papers to the Historical Society, left the interviews of people who are long gone, like Urban Van Susteren, who I would never get to, rather than just saying you can read what I quoted, and that's the only thing worth hearing from somebody like Van Susteren. Reeves left his actual notes from his interviews. And we all have a responsibility to do that, so we can build that every new biography has a bit more material, and yet it is rare for people to do that. And I was really lucky that people like Reeves did it, and that it was sitting there at the Wisconsin Historical Society for me to tap.
That is very true and very appropriate. And that gets to another question here, and it relates to some of the ones we're getting from folks. It is brave to, and not try to over compliment you one way or the other, but it's kind of brave to take on somebody who's had a lot of books written about them, because you have to assume you can write something more that you can add to the canon.
Yeah. So you're too polite to phrase the question the way that it probably ought to be phrased, which is, why did the world need the 101st biography of Joe McCarthy?
Yeah.
And partly is you've got chutzpah and you assume that you will say something different. Partly it was that the story seemed timely for the reasons that we've been talking about, in terms of being a story not just of our history but of today. And partly it was I almost walked the plank and fell off of it. And exactly a week after I told my publisher and my wife that I was not going to get access to the Marquette archives and to all the papers from the Bethesda Naval Hospital that I was counting on to understand McCarthy's health situation, which I think was critical to what ended up happening to him. In both cases, exactly a week after I said it wasn't going to happen, I was shocked that it happened. And it was lucky for me that it happened. Would I have had a book breaking any new ground? Who knows? I did have the transcripts of the closed-door hearings. They had been out for a while, but nobody had taken a really deep dive on them. But I was lucky, and I was a pain in the neck, as I said, and so people ended up, for reasons whatever, saying, yes on those. But
this book is getting a lot of attention right now. You just had a very lovely, kind of the author's favorite interview in the New York Times the other day. And I'm wondering whether you think, as much as you moved the ball down the field, and as much as this book did add to our understanding of McCarthy, that it would be getting the attention that it is if Barack Obama was still president of the United States, or if there was a different person in the White House.
So, good question. Short answer, no. And longer answer, I wouldn't have written the book if there were a different person in the White House. But it is partly a matter of luck and partly a matter of timing on any book getting attention, especially on a historic figure that we've seen so much of in the past.
So let me ask you now, as we circle around here to the end, a question about the impact of McCarthy, and I'm a big fan of your use of that term "long shadow" in your subtitle. One of the things that Joe McCarthy did in going after communists and fellow travelers and people he accused of things was that he targeted a lot of African Americans, and particularly not just him, but the whole Red Scare targeted people like Coleman Young and others who had been involved in a nascent civil rights movement. Do you think that McCarthyism slowed down or had an impact on the rise of civil rights and the rise of the civil rights movement in this country?
So I think McCarthyism's greatest impact is the one that we know him for, which is the anti-communist movement. And I think, by the way, that he did as much damage to anti-communists, or maybe more, as he did to communists. But I think there were three other movements that remain important movements today that McCarthy jumped in on and did some really despicable things. One is, I think that there's lots of evidence that he might have been an anti-Semite. Number two is he was clearly a gay basher and was one of the orchestrators of what was called then the Lavender Scare. And the other is the whole issue of race. And he was on the wrong side of that. And I think that McCarthyism, when it's used broadly today by everybody to sort of slur the people that they don't like, it should have a wide net to cast, because Joe McCarthy had a wide net. And I think that was, I don't know whether at his heart he was a racist or anti-gay or really anti-Semitic, but I think he was willing as an opportunist to play to anything that he thought was going to work. What he was, I think, maybe ironically more than anything, was anti-elitist and anti his notion of what elites were. So he was anti-East Coast and anti-West Coast and anti-Wall Street. And that was playing to a lot of populist sympathies, but perverting a lot of populist sympathies. I think that Joe McCarthy, the reason I use the word demagogue rather than the word populist is I don't think he was a populist. To me, populism has lots of upside to it. He was a demagogue, and there's not a whole lot of upside to being a demagogue or a bully.
It's an awfully good place to circle around to. I'll make the interviewer's mistake of asking one last question rather than letting you leave on a perfect point. And that is to ask you, you've written so many powerful books. Are you working on something else now?
I am, and I'm going to tell you really briefly the title of it. I've got too soon a deadline for this next book, and it is my reward to myself and my publisher's reward to me for having spent 3 long years with Joe McCarthy. And it is a book called The Jazzmen, Jazzmen, and the subtitle does a better job of explaining what it is. The subtitle is How Duke Ellington, Satchmo Armstrong, and Count Basie Transformed America. And I think there aren't 3 better people that you could spend time with, and I think theirs is an incredibly uplifting story about how they changed the racial horizon of America and set the table in many ways for the civil rights movement.
Boy, that is, what a way to kind of clean up the having dealt with McCarthy thing there.
Right. Thank you. I hope so.
Larry Tye, this has been fabulous. We got to ask quite a few of our questions from folks. We've had a wonderful crowd of about 100 with us tonight. I want to thank the book festival folks, the library folks, all the other people that helped to put this together. I want to remind people that it is, in fact, the Wisconsin Magazine of History that you and I have both written for, and that you will have an article coming out in very, very soon. And I think with that, we'll turn it back to our host.
So can I just say really quickly that I want to thank John, who was a terrific interlocutor tonight, and I want to thank Connor, who was really wonderful in assembling this program and having to deal with my incessant emails over the last month or two. So thank you.
Really, Larry, you're not among the even most people who sent me email today. Anyway, I'm only here to say thank you both to John and to Larry. Thank you both so much. This was absolutely wonderful. Exactly the kind of conversation that the book festival exists to have. I really appreciate you making the time here in the middle of a beautiful Madison July evening, and to all of you gathering from all over the country to watch this, thank you as well. I do also want to mention partners at the Madison Institute. Many of you found out about this event through them. They are always wonderful to work with. I know Fred's here somewhere. Maybe he's not logged in as himself, but thank you, Fred.
Fred and Marilyn are both with us.
Yeah. And I also want to mention our book-selling partners at A Room of One's Own bookstore. Larry is only here because he wrote this book, and we really get to do this because you buy the book. So if you have the means right now during quarantine, please click the button here at the bottom of the screen.
The green button at the bottom.
The green button. That'll send you to A Room of One's Own, but I'm sure Larry has a local bookstore as well. So if you want to support Larry's local bookstore, I'll give him a second to mention.
So I want to support your bookstore, and I want to make an offer that maybe nobody will find attractive. But when you put in your book order, if you want it personalized, if you want it signed, we'd normally be doing a book signing. Just indicate that when you put in your order. I will send a signature plate personalized to you, and I'm sure the bookstore has no problem letting me know that. And I want to just say one last thank you, which is to Fred, who is an extraordinary person who we don't see up on the screen here today, but he was supportive of me in the Bobby Kennedy book and in this one, and he's an extraordinary guy. But thank you all.
He sure is. Well, thank you everyone for being here tonight, and we'll see you when we come back for our next Wisconsin Book Festival event on September 17th with Yad Gyasi.
Thank you so
everyone.
much.
Have a great night.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.